All right, so I am here once again with my friend and pop mythology colleague, Jess Kroll, who is the film critic for Pop Mythology, which this podcast is officially a part of. And of course, Jess also appeared with me on this podcast a little over 2 years ago on 2 episodes covering 10 films about collapse. And that was before the show became inactive for reasons I discussed in the last episode. So, hey, Jess, I'm excited to have you back on here and doing this podcast together with you again. How are you doing?
I'm doing, all things considered, just personally doing all right. And yeah, it's nice to be back. Always fun talking about movies with other people, not just about, art and film, but also social messaging, political messaging, cultural messaging, all of those important things.
So, I'm just going to introduce today's film. Today, we'll be talking about Strange Days, a film released in 1995, directed by Kathryn Bigelow, known for films such as Zero Dark 30 and The Hurt Locker. And before I mention some of the other main credits of the film, I just wanted to briefly mention for the audience why I wanted to kick off the revival of this podcast by discussing this movie in particular. So with the expansion of the theme of this podcast to include more dystopian stories, I thought this was a good movie to start out with. First of all, just the new title of this podcast, which is Strange Days, Here We Come. And I explained the logic behind that title in the last episode. But obviously it makes reference to the film Strange Days. And I found out while rewatching this movie recently that even the title of the movie is also a reference to a pre-existing work of pop culture, and that is both a song and an album by The Doors. So there's a song and an album called Strange Days. And there's a cover version of the song Strange Days that appears in the film, which features the original keyboardist of The Doors, Ray Manzarek, on the keyboards. But we can talk a little bit more about that a little bit later when we talk about memories. But the other reason I wanted to start with this film is that, it's a dystopian film. And despite being made in the mid-90s and being dated in some ways that we'll be discussing, it does feel quite relevant today for various reasons that we'll talk about. And so that's really the main reasons. It's not because I'm necessarily a huge fan of the movie or anything like that, but there's just kind of like a cool thematic connection in that way. And then to go back to the other main credits of the film, it was co-written by Jay Cox, who has collaborated on some screenplays with Martin Scorsese for Age of Innocence and Gangs of New York, and none other than James Cameron, who, of course, among other things, is famous for two dystopian films in particular, Terminator 1 and Terminator 2, and then I don't know, Jess, would you consider Avatar a dystopian film?
I'm not exactly sure. It feels almost like a utopian film becomes like destructive.
Yeah, it's a good point. There are, of course, a number of fictional works that contain aspects of both utopia and dystopia.
Yeah.
And certainly I can see some of the utopian aspects of Avatar. And the backdrop, though, of like the corporate greed and imperialism,
Mm-hmm.
I think definitely that has elements of dystopia, at least, even though it's not typically categorized as a dystopian film.
It's almost sort of because like Pandora in Avatar is quite idyllic. It's very nice. Everything is in harmony. And then, the humans come in and the human world depicted in Avatar would definitely be a dystopia. I feel like I've heard a rumor somewhere that a later Avatar movie is going to take place in the human. That's definitely going to be a dystopian film.
Interesting.
The human world in the Avatar universe is dystopian in ways. Right. Sure.
And in the first film, it's almost like the intrusion of dystopia into utopia.
Yeah, that's a good description of it, actually.
Yeah. Do you consider yourself a fan of the Terminator films?
I would say the first two Terminators are good, but on a whole, the franchise.
A widely shared opinion, I think. I definitely feel that way as well. So I guess I'll give a little summary of the basic premise of Strange Days. And then there's something really interesting that I learned about the development of this film that I'll share before we get into the film itself. So the film was released in 1995 and it takes place in 1999. So it was imagining the near future. And of course, it evokes some of that millennial Y2K apocalyptic anxiety of the time. And it's basically kind of a mashup of dystopian sci-fi with mystery and crime noir elements. And it features a technology they call SQUID. It's an acronym for Superconducting Quantum Interference Device, whatever. But the device can first of all record the memories of something happening to a person as it's happening, as well as the feelings the person is feeling. And then secondly, other people can then use the technology to relive that event happening to the other person and also experience the feelings that other person was feeling. Now, the interesting thing that I mentioned involves the screenwriters, James Cameron and Jay Cox, but mostly the latter. So for James Cameron, I read that the inspiration was mostly the 1992 LA riots, which in turn were connected to the beating of Rodney King by police officers in 1991. But more interesting to me is what his co-writer, Jay Cox, might have contributed to the script. So apparently, back in 1969, Jay Cox and Martin Scorsese approached the science fiction author Philip K. Dick. Now, Philip K. Dick, and I've written about this on Pop Mythology, but is not just one of my favorite sci-fi authors, but one of my favorite authors, period. And they apparently wanted to adapt his novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And they ended up not working on it. And the movie version was eventually written by Hampton Fancher and David Peebles, and of course, directed by Ridley Scott. But the interesting part is that, so Philip K. Dick wrote two works, one short story and one novel that both imagine a technology similar to the one depicted in Strange Days. And he wrote these stories decades before Strange Days. The short story is called The Little Black Box, and the novel was actually Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is that very same novel that he and Scorsese initially wanted to adapt, but for whatever reasons didn't. But anyway, in the short story and the novel, there's a technology that's referred to as the empathy box. And then when you connect yourself to it, it allows you to feel what someone else is feeling, like not just conceptually, but actually feel the visceral feelings. And so it's called the empathy box. And the technology central in Strange Days also basically lets you feel what other people are feeling. And it's a little more complicated than that, and we'll go into it. But I mention it just because there seems to be this very direct connection between the central technology in Strange Days and the technology that Philip K. Dick wrote about that Jay Cox wanted to adapt. So it's almost like maybe he ended up not working on, Blade Runner, but then said, okay, I'll just go write a different script that has the technology in the novel and the short story. And Blade Runner didn't have an empathy box, but the novel had it. The original novel had this kind of technology, which it's a really interesting connection to me. I don't know, does that strike you as interesting?
I read briefly about that as well, looking into Jay Cox before recording. He has quite a good screenwriting record if you look at him. And I also found that very interesting. And I can't help wondering, when did Scorsese and Cox think of adapting Philip K. Dick? Because a 1870s Scorsese version of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep would have been quite interesting. This was Taxi Driver era. This is Mean Streets era Scorsese. And I can't help imagining what that would have been like. Although I guess we wouldn't have gotten Blade Runner and then years later Blade Runner 2049. Martin Scorsese is my favorite filmmaker of all time, but I feel as though that might not have been a good trade.
Yeah, I feel the same way, because as obviously great a filmmaker as Scorsese is, and it would have been interesting for sure, but those two Blade Runner films are among my absolute favorite science fiction films, and I wouldn't want anything different about them. And so Glad it didn't happen.
One note that I find interesting that, and you mentioned about James Cameron being highly inspired by the LA riots. That was something that I noticed, I guess jumping ahead a little bit, but there is a quote towards the end of Strange Days where Tom Sizemore's character says all of this over a random traffic stop. And that struck me as very related to the LA riots as well, which were caused by what is essentially a random traffic stop, which resulted in that savage beating. But that struck me as a very poignant line.
Absolutely. That line definitely makes that connection. And also visually, in the scene where Mace, the Angela Bassett character, is getting beat up by a number of police officers with batons, seemed to me to be deliberately filmed in such a way as to echo that infamous incident.
Yeah, it's a visual that is hard to misinterpret.
Yeah. So let's start with each of us just sharing our basic overall thoughts and feelings about the film as a whole before we then zoom in on specific details and themes and things like that.
It's interesting because this film is sort of a movie that has its own like myth in my personal life, because I was in high school when this movie came out, and I remember being interested in dystopian fiction, science fiction from a very young age. So I wanted to see this movie, and it didn't play in theaters very long in my area. It came and went very quickly. So I ended up seeing it. My parents and I ended up renting it on VHS way back when you could do such things. And we got about 20 minutes into the movie. I remember it was the first scene with Juliette Lewis, the first memory of Faith, that when they go skating and stuff like that. And between the robbery at the start and the sort of the brutality of just going through the city, and then, the scene with Juliette Lewis, my mom just decided this is not appropriate for her teenage son to watch and stopped the movie. We never finished it. And I never watched the film until finally this week to prepare for this. So I waited 30 years to watch this movie, and it was always on my list of, someday I'm going to watch this. I'm going to watch this. And I'm glad I finally did, because this was quite enjoyable. I ended up watching it twice this week, unfinished for 30 years, and then watched it twice through.
It's like watch it with a vengeance. Yeah.
Yes. And I'm glad I watched it the second time because, of course, the revelations you have throughout the film informs the second viewing, which is my favorite thing in any sort of narrative art, is when there's something that you have to watch 2 times or have to read 2 times or have to listen to 2 times, whatever it is. I enjoyed this quite a bit. It's interesting in that it has such a film noir structure with the sort of science fiction and dystopian and thriller imagery. And it's funny looking back at, this is 1995 when this was made, and there are things in it that are still, obviously we'll be talking about the things that are prescient today, things that we're still sort of catching up with, but also sort of the level of technical and cinematic skill on display here. All the first person sequences that are very well staged. I was quite impressed. I only really know Kathryn Bigelow from Hurt Locker and Zero Dark 30. I've never even seen Point Break. So this was a different side of her as a filmmaker. Impressive.
Yeah. I too, on the whole, like it. And as mentioned, it's very much a 90s film in some ways, and it is dated in some ways. But despite that, I think it remains very relevant, maybe more relevant now. And there are some things that kind of foresee certain technological trends occurring now in really interesting ways. Although just really quickly, I kind of wanted to get a couple things out of the way. But I just felt like for listeners who are interested in possibly watching the film, if they haven't already, and it might be a good idea to do so if you're going to listen to this episode, because we will be talking about spoilers. But I feel like the film should come with a content warning. I mean, your mom was right. And it's there's a scene in particular, there's a scene of sexual violence. And I don't feel like a scene like that would fly today. I get the intent behind it, and I understand what they were trying to do, and it is thematically relevant in some ways, but I also feel like it could have been filmed differently, maybe less gratuitously. And it felt, again, like sort of like an 80s, 90s sensibility where they just didn't really think about it. Whereas I think now there would be a bit more scrutiny about it. And I don't think it, like for me, I'm not going to cancel the film because of it. I'm not going to not watch it or like dismiss the film because of it. But I do feel like anyone with, any trauma or things like that just might be a good idea to approach it with caution. And like, I was surprised because I watched this on Hulu and it didn't have, how Netflix has some of those little content warning tags on the side, like on the upper left of the screen when you play something. I was deliberately looking to see if there, and I couldn't find, I don't know if I just missed it somehow, but I didn't see any kind of label or tag or anything. So I just felt like we should provide that just for people who might be interested in watching it. And the other thing, and this is more of a personal annoyance for me, but I just don't like the way Asian people are represented in this film. It's another 90s. Yeah, it's like another 90s thing, I think, where I think of films like Falling Down, or even one that we talked about in the 10 films about collapse, Menace to Society, where I felt like the intent was positive. It was trying to criticize a real problem, but it kind of risks dehumanizing some of the characters. And it was really common in the films of this era to just, like, Asian people were just like background props, and yeah, and there was like that restaurant scene where they're just all acting all, they're all reacting hysterically and freaking out. That one scene in the beginning, and there's that scene where Lenny Nero, played by Ray Fiennes, he's trying to sort of bring on a new client. He's like, oh yeah, you can experience anything you want, and see that guy over there with a drop dead gorgeous Filipino girlfriend. And I'm just like, okay, if that girlfriend were white, would he have even mentioned, oh, see that guy over there with a white girlfriend,
Oh, no, definitely not. Definitely not.
Yeah. And
just the exoticism that is still rather prevalent when it comes to especially Asian women.
For sure. And still an issue in media in general, but even more so like in the 80s and 90s. And so that for me is like a personal annoyance. But again, I wouldn't, not watch the film for that. But I want to just quickly get that out of the way. But yeah, on the whole, for reasons we'll be discussing, I do think it's a worthy film to watch for social political themes. And on the whole, I liked it.
It's interesting you mentioned, like it probably wouldn't be filmed this way nowadays. It feels like in the 80s and 90s, we were just a lot less, humanity in general was a lot less knowledgeable about trauma and the effects of trauma. And I think that's why things like this can be filmed. That scene in particular, that is brutal in so many ways. And me personally, having never experienced such a thing, I don't know if I can be a good judge of whether or not such a thing should exist now. But in terms of this film, it is very effective in what it's trying to do in amplifying the terror of that moment and just the depravity of the person who would do that. Also, you mentioned the opening scene with the robbery, and actually one of my first notes that I wrote when watching this film was, nowadays, if you saw a group of masked men breaking into the back of a restaurant, they'd be carrying ICE badges.
I was just going to say,
instead of stealing money, they'd be stealing people.
Well, we'll definitely be coming back to that when we talk about the over-policing elements in the film. And speaking of 90s idiosyncrasies, some of the dystopian visual imagery felt very 90s,
Yes.
with like all-out mayhem, like exaggerated chaos on the streets as Lenny, Ray Fiennes' character, again, is like driving through the streets and just like, people running through the streets, setting fires, and it had a very sort of 90s feel.
See, I don't know how dated that is, because according to some news sources, that's exactly what Los Angeles is right now. It's just people running down the street setting fire to everything.
Exactly. And then we're gonna definitely be coming back to that. But there was something interesting. I caught a subtle pop culture reference in like after the robbery scene when Lenny is driving through the streets and he turns on the radio and there's a talk show radio. And one of the caller calls in. And in addition to complaining about gas being $3 a gallon, I'm just like, what?
Yeah, that's hilarious.
But of course, I mean, back then, obviously, different time. But there's one caller, it's the same caller, the guy who complains about the gas price. And then he says, when the talk show host says, so like, do you have any wild plans? And he says something like, no, what's the point? Nothing changes on New Year's Day. And the first time I saw this film years ago, I mean, a lot went over my head the first time when I saw it many years ago, but I definitely didn't catch the reference then. But I was like, oh, wait a minute. That's the line from the U2 song, New Year's Day. And Bono, part of his lyrics and what that he sings, it says like, nothing changes on New Year's Day, and the song is like a reference to the Polish Solidarity movement, which in turn is related to like themes of authoritarianism. And so I thought that was like an interesting, subtle connection.
I didn't make that connection. I'm not familiar with that song, I think, but that's very interesting. That's fascinating. I like that.
Yeah, and it's when U2 was more overtly political. I mean, arguably they're still socially conscious, and occasionally they'll have like a political song. But early on, like the early albums, when they were much more sort of influenced by bands like Joy Division, and they were like very political. And the song New Year's Day is on arguably their most political and angriest album, War. And so it just like, I somehow just caught it. I could have easily missed it, but then I just thought it was a really cool connection.
That's a good catch as well. I ended up researching gas prices at the time of the film and the day that it's supposed to take place. So the average gas price in America in October '95 when this film came out was $1.13 per gallon. The average gas price in December 1999, which is when this movie took place, was $1.28 per gallon, which
that
then
is
spiked to 173 in March of 2000. Also, the same caller in that scene talks about fifth grade kids are shooting each other at recess.
Oh, yeah.
And that was another thing that has very, very sadly become normalized, is kids shooting each other. Columbine, the Columbine massacre, which I think most people recognize as the first like school shooting, that didn't happen until April 20th, 1999, which would be, like 9 months before this movie takes place.
Yeah, no, that what seemed like a negligible little detail, that little talk show segment had a surprisingly dense amount of relevant details there, and connections.
Well, there's also the scene where they make predictions for 2000, and I noticed some of them. The one that stood out to me was, by 2025 there will be a second female president.
Yeah, I remember that. Alas.
Yes. Also, another notable thing about this film, we're talking about how it's still surprisingly relevant today, but even in terms of like near future for them, we haven't really discussed it yet. But there's the shooting that starts this entire thing, the murder of Jericho 1, the politically conscious gangster rapper. The film was released exactly 11 months before Tupac Shakur before he died. It was filmed. It was released October 13th, 1995, and Tupac Shakur died September 13th, 1996.
Whoa. That is interesting. I didn't make that connection at all. Thank you.
I mean, obviously, it's not a connection that could have been made at the time, but that's just a really interesting, just an interesting connection in general. So.
Well, and also a sort of minor detail that might be interesting for some is that in the film, as it seems like we're getting into the murder of Jericho 1, But of course, that was kind of like a small scale conspiracy, conspiracy on a small scale between like these two cops that want to cover up their crime. And, I don't know much about them, but I do know that there are conspiracy theories out there regarding the murder of Tupac, that supposedly it wasn't just a straightforward beef between him and Biggie, that it was, I don't know the details, but just that I know that
there's a lot of theories about the murder of Tupac, and that's why my brain sort of connected Jericho 1 to Tupac Shakur, is because a lot of those same ideas are, in the ether.
Yeah. In the beginning, I was debating whether to go into technology first or the police brutality and racism aspects, but we've already begun talking about Jericho 1, so let's just continue with that first. And so before Vincent D'Onofrio became the kingpin, he was a crazy, violent, racist cop. It was kind of interesting after watching him as the kingpin, in more recent years, and like seeing his younger version in this film. And he is, of course, one of the two bad guy cops who are behind the murder of the politically conscious rapper Jericho 1. And part of the film involves them trying to suppress that truth, going through any means necessary to whatever they got to do, kill people, whatever, suppress evidence to keep that from becoming exposed. So any particular thoughts on those two cop characters or the actors, Vincent D'Onofrio, and the other guy is super familiar. He was like in Dark Knight.
Yeah,
what's his name?
William, what's Fichtner, something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Recognizable, primarily character actor. He was in Heat. He was in Armageddon. Yeah, he has a very recognizable face. It was funny seeing him and Vincent. I immediately pegged Vincent D'Onofrio as well. I was like, oh, that's Vincent D'Onofrio. And of course, as soon as I see him, I'm like, oh, they're going to be doing something bad. He always ends up playing like the bad guy is Vincent D'Onofrio. It's funny thinking, he was he was notable in Full Metal Jacket. He played Private Pyle.
Yeah. Oh, well, so bad guys and unhinged guys, I guess.
Yes.
Because Private Pyle wasn't necessarily bad per se, but he was unhinged, obviously.
Yeah.
So do you feel that the themes of police brutality and institutionalized racism in the film were handled well, or were like too heavy-handed, or what were your personal thoughts on that?
I don't think it was very heavy-handed at all. I think that it was there as an undercurrent in a similar way that it's always sort of there as an undercurrent in all society in general, even if it's not the focus of the film or a particular issue at the time. It's always sort of there as an undercurrent. The last image that we have of Vincent D'Onofrio in this film, of him pulling, the body of his partner when they're both handcuffed, and he's got his partner's blood all in his face, and there's the streamers of New Year's Eve falling down. Amazing image. And he's, waving the gun around, and he drops the real, slur of the entire film at that moment. But what was interesting for me is that in the end, for all of its criticism of police and all the brutality of the police in the film, in the end, they are saved by sort of almost the cliche one good cop. The deputy commissioner ends up saving them.
Yeah.
And I read that Bigelow said that she didn't want to make the system, however you define the system, like the enemy, because then that means that she said something along the line, I can't remember exactly what it was, but she said something like, we would then be the enemy because we are also still perpetuating this system rather than working to change it. That's a very interesting idea.
Indeed. And that point you just touched on, I also felt like was a really interesting and also revealing one as well, in the sense that, it ultimately lets the system off the hook. But there's another accidentally revealing moment, I thought, where the cops are quick to violence towards both Lenny and Mace. Again, Angela Bassett's character, who plays Lenny's close friend, but quick to exhibit violence against them. And of course, that sort of moment we alluded to earlier where they're beating Mace with, despite her physical prowess, I must add. I mean, wow, Angela Bassett's character in this film, very reminiscent, I thought, of Linda Hamilton in Terminator 2. Like the physical build. Yeah, like that she had, that presumably to get ready for this role.
I just think Angela Bassett should never wear sleeves ever. And if she does, it should be something like the black suit that she has when driving, because she looks amazing. She is amazing in this movie.
She is amazing in this film. Yeah, the raw physicality and like her fight scenes and just like the personality of the character. Yeah, it's a very compelling character. But anyway, so back to that point. Oh, well, go ahead.
I was just going to heap more praise on Angela Bassett and say her physical presence is so great in this film, but then also the emotion that she has, the way that every scene that she's in, she's holding these feelings back. You know, you learn as the film goes on, you see it, you know, if you watch it a second time, you see like she's holding these things inside of herself that she just can't let go, but she also can't quite express them as much as she wants to, as much as her character seems to want to, because she is very straightforward. But phenomenal performance for
it is. It's yeah. She does a lot with that character. She adds a lot of nuance to it, or to that character. But that accidentally revealing moment I was about to allude to was when, so the cops are quick to violence against Lenny and Mace. But when the Vincent D'Onofrio character, while handcuffed to his partner, starts like menacingly walking towards Angela Bassett's character, Mace, and the cops are like, stop. And then he pulls out his gun. They're like, drop it. And he keeps advancing with this crazed look on his face. His intent is clear. And they're just like, drop it. I mean it. No, really. Seriously, this time, drop the gun. And it's like that. We have seen real life versions of that I don't want to get us too like sidetracked and go too deeply into real life incidents, but we have seen that where there are incidents in which police are quick to violence, often lethal violence, in situations that do not warrant it. And yet in other situations that do seem very dangerous, and yet they're slow to take equivalent actions that they so quickly take against other people of certain demographics. And so that I felt like was really interesting. And it's not just the fact that, it's not just the fact that Vincent D'Onofrio was white, but that he is a fellow cop, despite being clearly a very obviously bad cop. But they give him a lot of leeway in that scene when he just keeps advancing. He's like raising his gun. They're like, stop, drop it. It's only when I think he's literally right. He utters that expletive. Yeah. And is right about to pull the trigger. I think they finally then take him out.
Well, he was also, at that point, he was also arrested for murder. So you have a known murderer stalking through the street, aiming his gun. And yeah, it isn't until the very last second that they put him down, which, for dramatic purposes, I can see. But at the same time, it is sort of reflective of, a real life phenomenon.
I'll just name one specific instance just very quickly. But, of course, there's the very famous incident with Kyle Rittenhouse where, he literally had an assault weapon out in the open, was holding it, and is walking towards the police. And if you watch that clip, and sure, he raises his arms, but there are so many situations with live video or recorded video that we have seen where people aren't even armed at all, and the police fire. And here's a guy who has an AR-15 slung around his body, and they're just like, okay, doop-de-doop. He's walking towards them, and
I try not to, in terms of social media, I just post whatever it is that I want to say, and I usually let people comment however they wish to. These days, I just block people who are going to be jerks about it. But one time I posted about Kyle Rittenhouse, and that was when I got the most pushback. Was people saying like he was under attack, he got attacked by a guy with a skateboard, and I'm like, oh yeah, you have an assault rifle. Somebody comes and hits you with a skateboard. I think I know who's going to be winning that fight. And then of course people want to say like, oh, the people that he murdered weren't good people. He didn't know that. He didn't know these people. He just murdered them. It doesn't matter at that point.
It's interesting because there's a connection, I feel, with the use of phones to record just things in general, but incidents of like excessive use of force by the police or police brutality. And in this film, there's a consumer technology. It's the squid tech is used not intentionally, but it ends up being accidentally used to record, so to speak, the murder of Jericho 1 by the two cops. So this makes me think of like issues of surveillance, but surveillance going multiple directions, because there's that scene with Lenny and one of his clients when Lenny's like, so what do you know about this technology? And the client is like, well, I just know the feds developed it at first, and then now it's like black market, which is also an interesting line because it is kind of interesting how a lot of commonplace consumer technology now was initially developed either by or for the military. So like, maybe the most famous example being the internet. But also things like GPS and radio communication and various other technologies, drones. And so it's kind of interesting that Squid in the film is also, started out as like developed by an intelligence agency and then becomes like this underground black market consumer tech. But anyway, so the surveillance in the film is interesting because it's not just the usual sort of cliched dystopian trope of the state surveillance, right? It's kind of like, the whole recording of the cops killing Jericho 1 comes about because the music industry manager guy, Philo Gant, played by another guy who's always playing bad guys. I'm not really sure.
Michael Wilcott?
Yeah. Yeah. He was also in The Crow.
Michael Wincott.
Yeah. Wincott, yeah. And he was also in The Crow playing a similar character, it seems like. The Crow, the version with the first one with Brandon Lee. But
the only crow.
The only crow. Yes, thank you. Thank you. The only crow ever. Other than the comic book, which is also pretty good. But anyways.
The only movie crow. The only movie crow.
The technology, the surveillance is done by this manager guy, Philo Gant, against Jericho 1. He is, one of his artists because of whatever. I can't even remember the specific reason, but so wants to keep tabs on him, I guess. So it's like, it's not state surveillance. It's like sort of like, I guess like corporate surveillance in a way of an artist to control the artist or keep tabs on him. But it ends up accidentally becoming a sort of like a everyday person's tool of surveillance against police corruption. Sort of like the way phones are these days. In many cases, which I thought was interesting. Like, what do you think about that?
I can definitely see it that way. It's interesting that you mentioned that they talk about that the squid technology started by the feds, and they said that it was a way of monitoring their behavior. So it was essentially like a body cam, but it feels more like it would have been developed as governmental surveillance rather than a way of policing the police. So that was an interesting little thing that they said in the film. I actually kind of looked at the squid technology, and I found, this might be me stretching, but I found some parallel between that and social media nowadays, especially, what is it, like TikTok, Instagram, things like this, where people are always posting about themselves. There's the line that I think it's one man's mundane life is another man's technicolor.
Yeah.
And that struck me as, it's sort of reality television-ish, except that, reality television has never been real in any way whatsoever. But now looking at it in terms of social media, where people are constantly posting videos of themselves, and it's used in a similar way to the squid technology here, where it's a lot of people try to experience life that they'll never have through other people's, feeds or their posts and whatnot. Just, look at how much money this person has, or look at, the women this person is posing with, or look at the men this person is posing with, or, look at the food and look at the travel and all these types of things. And it seems like there's that same sort of sensationalism, because the squid here the draw is more lurid, apparently. But that's also just Lenny's market. There is possibly some other stuff. We see he has a very peaceful one with the man without legs. And there's that beautiful moment of the custom video he makes of him, which is just the experience of running along the beach. That's a beautiful little moment that shows that there's not just lurid content on this squid. There's also more mundane stuff. I'm sure there's probably in this world an entire market of just people eating food or skydiving, things like this. But there's the same sort of voyeuristic aspects of it. And I saw some of the things that, this is a little bit getting off the topic that you were talking about with the surveillance, but I saw some of the squid technology a little bit in the same way that people nowadays watch those like despicable sort of prank streamers that, go around. Like there's one guy who went to Japan and just shouted at Japanese people and was just making himself an obnoxious jerk. And then he came to Korea, and apparently he's been arrested and is going to be facing trial because he was doing, just despicable things. There's a whole audience for that, because some people want to be the worst version of themselves, but can't. So they would rather see somebody be the worst version of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also sort of the flip side of that, the schadenfreude of watching somebody who is the worst have bad things happen to them. And that seemed to me in the opening scene of this, where it's the robbery and then ultimately the person falls to his death. I imagine the audience for that could be both. It could be the people who want the sort of the adrenaline rush of the robbery and doing the horrible thing, in the same way that, watching some person on stream do, incredibly stupid stuff, to everyday people gives them a rush of like, oh, look at this, look at this. There's that excitement. And then there's also the flip side of ultimately seeing the robber fall to his death and die. There's probably a big audience for people who want to see the bad person get their comeuppance. So that's where I saw most of the parallel between them. But in terms of surveillance, we surveil ourselves nowadays. And that's sort of what the squid technology is as well, is these people are confessing on themselves. It's the old, like, the MF Doom line about, go into court and be their own star witness. Do you see the perpetrator? Yeah, I'm right here. It's the people filming January 6th, filming themselves doing the crime. And that's what was kind of interesting with the squid as well. It's just general surveillance of everybody, just catching the police violence, but catching their own as well, and then selling it. It was a fascinating little bit of foreshadowing of society.
Yeah, for sure. No, great parallels there with the vicarious experiencing of certain things, or the sort of voyeuristic elements of squid, the technology in the film, but the parallels with even just plain old social media, not even getting into more advanced tech, which we'll get into in a second. But that scene you mentioned, that sweet little scene where Lenny gives his friend, the guy who apparently from some accident lost his legs, the recording, or the little, that's another little 90s thing, was like the recordings are saved on these little CDs or these little mini discs. I'm like, oh, how quaint. But he gives him that little disc, and his friend plays it and is able to experience what it's like to have legs again and to run on a beach. And in a weird way, the character of Letty made me think of Clive Owens' character in another film we discussed in our episode on 10 Films of Collapse, Children of Men, where we get suggestions that the character was previously kind of a more idealistic character trying to make a difference actively in society, and then becomes this sort of jaded person just kind of looking out for himself. And certainly Lenny Nero in this film fits that profile as well. But in that scene, we see that the core goodness of that character remains, despite his sort of current, borderline, ethically dubious type of business. He has this good heart, right? And he didn't have to do this kind deed where he gives his friend this free recording, but he does it. And kind of suggests his later redemption, I feel like.
You're right about that. It does show, the kindness that remains there. And at the same time, it's kind of undercut because he also puts the woman that passes by. So it's sort of that lurid part of himself can't help but interject, even in this very good deed that he does. You're right. It does show that there is still, a caring person in there.
I want to get into a different kind of more advanced technology now that I also see a parallel with the squid technology in the film. There was an article on Time, although I'm sure there were other articles about it on other outlets, but back in June, there was a tool released, I believe by Midjourney. And what it does is it lets people upload photos, and then it will then turn that photo into an animated video clip. Realistic animation. I don't mean like it turns it into something that looks like a cartoon, but it realistically, well, quote unquote, realistically animates the clip. And there was a post made by somebody I didn't know, but apparently, the Time magazine article says that he was a co-founder of Reddit. And in the post, he shows an old photo of himself and his mom, his late mom. And he apparently used this new feature of Midjourney to upload the pic. And then it animated it. And then it showed her moving, like they were both moving, as opposed to a static image of just like this static hug. She's embracing him. She's smiling. She's laughing. She's moving around. And in the post, he said, like, I watched this 50 times. This is how she hugged me. And then in the comments are equally interesting, if not more so, because you have on one hand, people are like, "Aw, this here is a good use of AI," and some other comments are like, "Dude, don't go down this road. Like, don't do it. That's not how she hugged you. This is an artificial fake memory, and you want to remember it that way, or because of the emotional connection, you're tempted to believe that's how she actually moved." And maybe there's some subtle similarities. Maybe in some ways it does kind of resemble how she actually moved. But nevertheless, some of these commenters were making a point that this is a fake memory. And once you open up your mind to that, and here I was going off on my own thought process. Like the comments don't necessarily say this, but I started extrapolating that. I started imagining the implications. And there was one commenter that used a term that I found really interesting. He said cognitive security. And that sent me down a whole sort of imaginary rabbit hole where I was thinking, cognitive security, that's interesting. So what if it starts out this way? It starts out in a very relatable, understandable way where people just want like more vivid memories of loved ones that have passed. And so it's really tempting to kind of use this tech. And I can definitely see how there are ways in which it could be moving. But once that happens, once you open the door that way, and you could say that's kind of innocuous, but once that becomes normalized, like how much further is it before more substantial memories, like let's say the public memory of a public event, some big scale event, like the who, what, when, why, and where of that entire event gets manipulated or altered. And even just our very perception of things gets altered. I mean, that sounds outlandish, but I would argue that that's quite doable. And in some ways has already been done historically in less technologically advanced ways, but through things like psyops, which the CIA has openly admitted to doing. And so with that kind of powerful technology, you could start out with like a borderline innocuous thing of like getting our old photos animated, But then again, once that becomes normalized, I feel like there is a danger there. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
You couldn't see the physical reaction I was having when you were talking about the people saying, you don't want to open this door. I was just nodding my head furiously. I won't go into too much detail about this because it's not out yet, but the last book that I wrote actually addresses a lot of this. You mentioned cognitive security. That's a great term for it. But part of what I wrote about in my last book is using, yes, it starts with like, oh, I just want to have this sweet little moment with my mom. Yes, you are changing the memory of your mother, or you're changing your memory of that moment. It might be nice to have the refresher, but that's kind of what the photo is supposed to be for. When you change that document, you then change your memory of that moment. In the book that I wrote, there's an entire section about using the technology that comes from the technology we have now to alter history. And the example that I use in the book is altering Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. With the technology we have now, you could change that to make it so that he says something completely different. And if you then make that the most dominant version of that speech, then you effectively change history. Even without it, you talk about earlier versions of this technology. That was, what was it? Is it Joseph Goebbels just repeat the same lie over and over again until it becomes the truth? It's centuries of propaganda. Now it's just being done in a way that will be even more convincing. We see it every day. I mentioned January 6th, earlier, and immediately afterwards, everybody was like, this was a riot. This was an insurrection. And then 6 months later is, no. They were just, tourists that got misplaced. And now it's not even a crime anymore. Yeah, that's being done all the time. And technology in this film, or the technology you mentioned, is absolutely incredibly dangerous. People think it's just, I can, I can turn myself into a Studio Ghibli character. Well, there's also all the power that takes. But that's the beginning. In 30 years from now, history is completely altered. It's, we have jacks in our heads that have direct lines into 24-hour streams of propaganda, real-time rewriting of history. That's part of what this film was interesting for me about. Is you mentioned before that the film talks about how it's not just an audio video recording, it's also I imagine, touch, and I imagine other types of senses. That's where you can start to, and we see it in this film as well, that's where you could start to hijack people's brains. The only place where this film doesn't quite follow that trajectory is that there's no wireless connection to it. Once this technology merges with the wireless connection we have, the wireless world we have now, then it's people thousands of miles away getting into your actual cerebral cortex and altering your entire vision of the world.
Yeah. And
I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I did put 2 years of thought into this for this book that I write. So it is a topic that's quite fascinating to me.
Yeah, for sure. And the idea of the manipulation of memory, this might be the sort of most disturbing dystopian element for me from a big picture perspective. I can quite easily imagine an advanced version of this AI technology being misused, as you said, to completely rewrite history. And of course, there's a famous quote from George Orwell. I'm paraphrasing here, but basically, if you control the past, you control the future. And this brings me actually to the earlier reference I alluded to, where the title of this film itself is a reference to a song, an album by The Doors. And so I looked up the lyrics for that song, and there's a line here. I'll read it from the song. It says,
Please.
Well, there's two verses that I found interesting. So one says, strange days have found us. Strange days have tracked us down. They're going to destroy our casual joys. And then skipping down a bit in the other verse that was really interesting. Strange days have found us. And through their strange hours, we linger alone. Bodies confused, memories misused. So obviously that line right there, memories misused, I think was probably the inspiration for the movie to be titled after the song by The Doors.
No, that's the, Wow. I mean, it is a very cool title just in general, Strange Days. It captures a lot of stuff, but yeah, memories misused. That's pretty dead on. There's also sort of the idea, because I noticed it's not super often in the film, but there's a repetition of people saying like right here, right now. Mace screams at Lenny about that, but there's also the caller in the beginning, or another caller in the beginning, right? Talks about right here, right now. And that's what's sort of interesting when these in the film and maybe in real life, when people start sort of absorbing the memories of other people, of others, they sort of start to lose their own. They're no longer living the life that they have in the present. We see that with Lenny. He's using the squid to record the times with, especially with Faith, but he's not sort of living them in the moment as well. And to go back to social media, that's a criticism that we have. People don't do things to enjoy what they're doing. They do things to record it, to then send it to other people to, have them be, I don't know, jealous of them.
Yeah, no, and the squid, obviously, tech is used not so much to sort of be in that moment, be present in that moment, but you're kind of creating a product for others to consume in the film, right?
Exactly.
Exactly.
That's not true.
But yeah, but that point about Lenny's obsession with Faith. So it was interesting because Mace has this line when she's trying to plead with him to let go of this obsession. She says, Lenny, memories were made to fade for a reason. You got to let this go. And part of the reason he can't is the availability of this tech, right? So he's just like completely stuck in the past. And because the recorded memory is so vivid, and again, I can imagine like the AI tech that I mentioned earlier being coupled with things like haptic technology and things that kind of create a physicality in the experience, sort of like edging us closer to the kind of tech depicted in the film. But yeah, there's one thing, because I'm looking at the time here, and I wanted to allow some space to talk about like the aesthetic and technical aspects of this film as well. And maybe I'll start with one thing before passing it back to you. One thing I'll start with that I really appreciate and loved artistically actually does involve the character of Faith, Lenny's former love interest, played by Juliette Lewis. So apparently Juliette Lewis actually sang the two songs that she performs in the film. They're both PJ Harvey songs, which feels kind of like appropriate. It matches her, like, I think the 90s Juliette Lewis energy. And what really impressed me was her genuinely charismatic stage presence. Now, granted, it was aided by skillful camera work and lighting and whatnot, but that charisma can't be faked or, just purely made up for with camera work. It was real stage presence. And I think if I were at an actual performance of those songs, just like as a live audience member, that charisma would have still come through. Like, it kind of reminded me, well, there were aspects of it that kind of felt like a bit of Shirley Manson energy. I don't know if it was just the red hair, but and she's a great singer, so that doesn't hurt. But I was just impressed by the actual musicality and stage presence of her in those two PG Harvey cover songs. So that's something I just wanted to point out and appreciate that I really enjoyed. And then you want to share like any like aesthetic things or details?
Well, with the Juliette Lewis stuff, I didn't know those are PJ Harvey songs. I did notice that both of them use like licking imagery, and I thought that sort of speaks to the sort of like primal, sort of animalistic nature of especially the stage presence of that character, because there is a sort of animalistic appeal to what she's doing. There's a sort of feral quality to it all. And yeah, her performance on stage makes absolute sense because she's supposed to be like an amazing performer. In terms of aesthetics, I thought that they did a very good job. Like Nero's wardrobe was great. Lenny's wardrobe. Because he has, the jacket that he says is like very expensive. I think he name drops Armani or something like that. It's fake, but it looks nice. He is a smut peddler in this world, but he keeps trying to say like, no, this is an experience. This is, life in a way that you'll never be able to live it yourself. So he sees himself as more than that, which it seems to me that might be the filmmakers kind of winking at themselves. It might be Kathryn Bigelow sort of inoculating herself against criticism this movie did inevitably face of, being gratuitous, being overly violent, being too brutal, where she's saying like, yeah, it is those things, but there's also, profundity to it. There's a reason behind it. And we see that in Nero with he talks about the tie and the jacket separating himself from the rest of the world and all of the trash that's outside. And I thought that was very nicely done. All of the first person sequences, the one that we talked about before, the incredibly disturbing one, but then opening with, picking the lock and putting on the mask over the camera, the perpetrator looking at himself in the mirror, which when you look at it a second time, you're like, oh, narratively, they're dropping clues to Lenny to say here's where I am. I am looking directly at myself. And it's obvious who it is when you watch it a second time. And then going out, crossing between the apartments, stalking Iris through that scene, that entire thing being one continuous first person take, the camera work in those sequences is absolutely phenomenal, especially given the camera technology at the time. Those weren't little GoPros that they were carrying around. Those were the big, boxy, film recorder, I imagine. Or maybe they were little camcorders. Either way, it's harder than it would be nowadays. And of course, the way that Angela Bassett's costumes fit her character so well, the way that Juliette Lewis's costumes fit her character, and Ray Fiennes' costumes fit him. It was interesting because I find names fascinating. I love doing research on naming conventions in different cultures. And when it comes to fictional characters, I'm also very interested in why characters are named certain ways. Obviously Jericho 1 is a hip hop name. You use a name like that and it's going to be very pointed. But then I started thinking about it with the name Lenny Nero. Lenny from Leonard, which means brave as a lion, but it also could mean bright one. But also the last name Nero, of course, taken from the Roman emperor, which there's a whole history with him, but he's mostly known for tyranny. That was a part of it. And you can see it sort of, one doesn't become as good of a salesman as Lenny Nero is in this film without having some tyrannical tendencies, because you just never let people get away with not doing what you want them to do. That's where persistence comes in. But also known for self-indulgence and debauchery. And that's exactly what Lenny Nero's brand is in this film. There's also the famous quote about Nero fiddling while Rome burned. That's exactly what Lenny is doing in this. He's selling this entertainment while the whole world is burning around him. Then, if we want to go down the names thing, Faith is obvious, but it's also, that's where, despite all evidence, Nero still believes in her, still puts her as, the center of his being. Mace is a weapon and is blunt, is straightforward, is the only person in the film that will tell Lenny what it is, sometimes in an almost cliche way. Yeah, I went through all the names of the main characters. Iris means rainbow, but it's also more likely tied to the colored portion of the eye, and she's the one who lets Lenny see the world through herself, see the truth, see the events.
Yeah, there's a lot of symbolism about seeing in the film, for sure.
Yeah.
Faith even says to Lenny at one point in the recording, "I love the way your eyes see." Just interesting. Well, I also want to comment a bit on the Nero name. So we've obviously been talking about this film from the standpoint of dystopia more explicitly than collapse, but there are a lot of obvious connections between dystopia and collapse, both direct and indirect, explicit and subtle. But Nero, and you already kind of mentioned a lot of what he's famous for, but Rome was in a state of collapse, right? Not a state of total collapse yet, but it was the beginning of a process of collapse. And it's important to remember that collapse, as the term is typically used, can mean different things, and often people use it to indicate a final state, and it can be that, but more typically it's used to indicate a process, and often a very lengthy process. And yeah, he's famous for self-indulgence and gross negligence amid the collapse. basically going down in history as one of the worst emperors. So that was kind of interesting, although I had trouble reconciling the severity of the historical Nero with Lenny's mixture of goodness and ultimate heroism with that initial kind of sleaziness.
That is kind of curious because, you know, through the film, he's mostly called Lenny. The name of Nero mostly comes up with the letters that are given to him by, you know, the bad guy when he's delivering, you know, the tapes. But yeah, mostly people are calling him Lenny, which is the more positive name. It would be the one taken from Leonard, brave like a lion, the bright one. And he's only referred to as Nero by people sort of wanting to put him down. So there's the one name that would be associated with the collapse, and there's the other name that's associated with the better parts of his character.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like both potentials exist in this person, as it does with all of us. Fortunately for this story and for this character, ultimately the heroic part prevails. But yeah, no, that was a really interesting review there of all the names and the symbolic and thematic relevance. So why don't you go ahead and give up a wrap-up statement of your assessment of Strange Days, both from just, you know, a regular film critic's perspective of the aesthetic merits of it, but also its relevance pertaining to the themes of this podcast, which are obviously dystopia and collapse.
Well, with a lot of dystopian fiction, what people do is they sort of, you know, take what's happening at the time or what they can presage of the near future and make it in a way that is sort of open-ended to interpretation. And that's one of the things that I really like about both this film and dystopian fiction in general is even if it wasn't the initial intention of the filmmaker or the author or whoever it is that's making the work, it is fun to find those connections. And it is fun to analyze the different portions of it, even if it's never intended. I enjoy films that just sort of let my mind run free. And that's what happens with this film often. That's what can happen with this film if you sort of buy into it and focus on those parts. There is some criticism of this film where it does feel sort of like a more or less traditional film noir with some window dressing almost, because it doesn't quite do as much with the technology and with the dystopian portions of it as is possible. As we mentioned before, it does sort of wrap up with, you know, the good cops coming in. It's hinted by Mace and Lenny that, you know, the release of the tape of Steckler and his partner murdering Jericho 1 would lead to mass uprisings, and we never see that part, and we never know if it's going to happen. Like this film takes place over the course of 2 days in, you know, a localized part of Los Angeles. It would be interesting to learn what happens in the months after this. Does that happen? Is this where the collapse begins? Is this the predecessor to it? So that's an interesting thing to think about. Overall, very well filmed, visually great, very good performances, entertaining. Like, I'm glad I finally, 30 years later, was able to get through this film. And I recommend it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great summation. I pretty much agree with all of that. And I'm glad you point out that the film, you know, despite the ways in which we did like it, you're right. It doesn't quite do as much as it could with some of the more dystopian collapse adjacent themes as it could have. It kind of does go more into sort of like a mystery noir kind of route, right? But given that, within those limitations, nevertheless, I thought it did a pretty good job overall. And not just that, like you said, it's ripe for analysis in ways that go beyond what the filmmakers, you know, the director and the writers may have initially intended. And so, yeah, it's on the whole a good film. And, you know, not on the level of something like Children of Men, certainly.
No.
That's a high bar.
Or you mentioned before Blade Runner, you know, I mean, yeah. But that's a very high bar for it.
Those are masterpieces, yeah. Yes. But having said all that, yeah, a pretty strong recommendation. Certainly, if you're interested in dystopia and or collapse, worth watching for those reasons. And yeah, that was our discussion of Strange Days. So thank you for joining us. Until next time, well, strange days, here we come.